The After-Death Journal of an American Philosopher, The Worldview of William James, by Jane Roberts, introduction by Seth, read by Martin John. 5. Mind and Medicine. Thursday morning, February 24, 1977. No one can doubt that the body's mechanisms are practical. They work, yet the very treatment of the body as if it were a machine effectively separates the individual from his own body, his physical well-being from his own value judgments, and the body's workings from his own desires and intents. Man then seems to be the victim of diseases that sweep upon him for no reason. But no pill will cure the soul's melancholy, and to whatever extent the medical profession separates man from identification with and responsibility for his body, it deepens that melancholy, and the patient sinks down into philosophical chasms in which all hope seems lost. In my time, at least, medicine had a one-to-one relationship with the patient who came, perhaps shaken and certainly anxious, to the physician's office. That office was often set aside only by a few closed doors from the physician's living quarters. Outside the lace-curtained windows, the family wash fluttered on the clothesline. The doctor's children, more often than not, could be heard giggling and running in the draughty hall between the office and living spaces, where they had been banished by their mother from the kitchen. The patient could relate to the doctor as another family man, whose own supper was even then cooking on the stove, the odors mixing with medicinal potions and sometimes superseding them in potency. The doctor's study, with its leather-bound volumes, solid desk, velvet hangings, and footstools, was after all not that different from a burgher's or a professor's study, except in its particulars. And in my time those particulars were relatively few. A stethoscope, thermometer, blood pressure testing device, some phenobarbital in liquid or pill form, bandages, iodine, cloves for dental problems, chloroform, but mostly a listening ear and attentive manner, with more sophisticated instruments belonging to the surgeon, who was, indeed, the only specialist. Croup and tuberculosis were the main complaints, the one caused by an infant's reaction to parental distempers, and the other by a melancholy that affected the breathing mechanisms themselves. Simplistic diagnosis, perhaps, yet the physician gave soothing potions for the one, along with stern lectures to the parents, and the prescribed rest or a visit to the mountains for the other, and these remedies worked as well, if not better, than the more sophisticated techniques that later were adapted. Maladies changed with the tempers and beliefs of the times. Darwinian and Freudian theories altered the previous philosophies of medicine and changed patients' beliefs about themselves in relation to disease. And in my time, the contradictory schools of optimism and pessimism showed in the behavior of physician and patient alike. Man, as the surviving animal, was to be treated in a no-nonsense fashion. It was better to be portly than thin and spindly, which meant being overly sensitive to the world. Tubercular and to possess characteristics ascribed to women, artists, and other temperamental folk who could not cope as well in the world as others. As a result, parents stuffed their children with food, those parents lucky enough to have suitable means of employment. Chubby children were proof of one's own survival economically, and the poor became a reproof to the democratic processes, examples of those who fell by the way in the battle of competitiveness, the weaker members of the species who could not quite keep up. Unfortunately, the school I've termed the optimistic one didn't have time to mature before it was superseded, yet there were signs of maturity and the development not followed, in which I myself took the highest interest. Psychic research was doubtlessly naive in many respects, perhaps too studiously high-minded, yet had science and psychology used it as a meeting point, both would have prospered and prevented the philosophic rigidity that developed in both fields subsequently. For while science and psychology each seemed to be moving ahead after my time, and while science particularly produced spectacular technological achievements, the philosophical motion was very limited, nor did these fields use any logic in choosing those beliefs they decided to accept or reject. Science, of course, was forced to admit Einsteinian principles, but psychology acted as if Einstein's concepts had no relation to the greater environment in which each person has his being. Mayer's subliminal self, for example, fits in quite well with Einsteinian physics, while the Freudian self is far too local a phenomenon, and the existence of precognition could also ride rather nicely along with Einstein's relative time. Psychology, however, ignored these very scientific theories that might have given a theoretical basis for the exploration of the soul, and settled instead upon the quite prosaic and deadening duty of fitting a Freudian ego with a Darwinian subconscious into an industrial society. In my time, at least, some scientifically oriented men were willing to investigate the existence of a soul, a task which even then took considerable daring. But afterward such attempts were discontinued, for who needs to investigate the reality of a fiction? Except for churches, then, the soul was not officially recognized, and the religions themselves, while giving the soul lip service, steadfastly refused to investigate its reality and labeled as heretics or demented anyone determined to do so. At least in my time, the telepath and clairvoyant, the medium and the dreamer were encouraged to speak up to the scientist. Now they were silenced, their abilities seen as examples of the worst kind of emotional indulgence, the result of hysteria. The words subconscious fraud became labels of the sorriest duplicity because the individual to whom they were applied was branded a liar by subconscious disposition, unable to see through his or her own fantasies. More pertinent, however, Nature was seen no longer as working for man or with him and his body, but as actively working against him. The individual was pitted in an unending battle for survival in the exterior world, against the land and his own fellows, and pitted in an even more horrendous battle against an instinctive subconscious that seemingly condemned him to act in certain contrary fashions because of psychological imprinting executed in childhood. Diseases, now named and labeled more thoroughly than ever before, assumed their own aspects of minute demonhood. The viruses and other elements in nature that seemed to exist for no other reason than to attack man's body, and the predisposition to illness itself resulting from events long buried by the mind, each triggering an unconscious response to which the individual was instantly vulnerable, and the effects of self-predictive behavior made themselves known, for the habits of diseases changed to fit the theories. With the development of medical technology and with the treatment of the body as if it were a machine, man lost his sense of identification with his nature and his sense of having any control over his own health. The medical sciences might pride themselves on the routing of superstition, for illness was no longer seen as the punishment of an angered God upon a sinner. The sinner at least had the option of repentance and ultimate salvation. However, while the enlightened citizen was surrounded by a hostile natural environment and an alien inner physical one as well, a body swimming with malignant viruses that could at any time and with no reason rise up to attack his entire system, and a consciousness that followed the unknown, capricious dictates of a repressed subconscious ran amok. In the face of such new facts of life, such modern enlightened concepts, how naive had the idea of a well-intentioned subliminal self seemed, or even the idea of a body naturally equipped to promote health and possessing its own healing processes. For though the latter belief still lingered philosophically, it was effectively neutered, and certainly no one was going to rely upon it. Not the physician, who related to his instruments more than he did to his patients, and not the patients, who learned to be more frightened of their own bodies than they were of the doctors. Preventative medicine often has at its roots the pessimistic belief that the body will doubtlessly get any given disease unless it is inoculated against it, tricked into accepting a small rather than a critical bout of illness. Medicinal research is also done on the diseased. No one questions those who remain healthy, who do not visit the hospitals. No one looks for the secrets of the healthy or seeks to promote ways of making these generally known. No one more than the physician is directly faced with life's incongruities. His training involves him in studies of the anatomy, in which cadavers must necessarily be used. His experience makes him an intimate of birth and death alike. Who else more closely sees life's contrasts, the bringing to the life process of birth amid pain and agony, the body in all of its aspects, with its exquisite capacities for pain and pleasure alike, the final gasping of the last breath as the patient escapes all earthly ministrations. Who is more familiar with man's estate, powers, and vulnerabilities, or with man's lack of knowledge? For it is cliché to speak of those patients who die despite excellent treatment and favorable prognosis, while others far more desperate live against all the rules of medical knowledge. The doctor is a man of practicality most of all, one who is faced with the alarming examples of man's failure to understand himself or his body. The healthy man has no need of the physician's services, so it is natural enough that the doctor is often of pessimistic temperament. He sees men at their worst, and so it seems to him that illness is and must be a constant in man's life. Indeed, it seems almost foolhardy and dangerous to suggest otherwise, for who knows what disease might be incubating now even in the most healthy of persons. The idea of health becomes almost a fictional quality as the existence of the soul, hardly any coincidence, for I believe that the same creative abilities that would give evidence of the soul are also those that would promote at least reasonable health throughout man's lifetime. Let this be regarded as the most Pollyannish of statements. Let me add a few embellishments. First, no statistics have been gathered in your time or mine on the numbers of the healthy, nor have any studies been conducted correlating the habits or beliefs of the healthy. Hospital and medical records, as mentioned earlier, necessarily deal with ill persons. Psychiatric studies are likewise formulated and carried out in the same prejudged fashion. The very suggestions meant by preventative medicine to foster health promote fears, nervousness, and stress conditions that in themselves lead to disease. Teaching the individual to look for symptoms utilizes suggestion in a way that leads to the anticipation of illness. Yet the anticipation of health seems unrealistic, dangerously optimistic, and misleading. Even in my time, however, the study of hypnosis clearly showed the importance of suggestion and emphasized the intimate connections between suggestion, behavior, and health. Medicine, never officially utilizing hypnosis, uses it well, and often in the most negative manner. Such phrases as the importance and mystery of magnetism were spoken often in my generation, turning many otherwise open-minded people away from solid research in the field. Granted, the proponents and early practitioners of hypnosis often over-dramatized their cases, claiming not only cures but miracles. Yet the substantial work done by respected men proved beyond a doubt two main points. 1. The existence of a power within man, latent but appreciable, to better his own condition, right his course, heal his body, accelerate learning and insight, and 2. The susceptibility of this power to suggestion. This power or energy, then, can be awakened and harnessed through suggestion, either through structured hypnosis or sometimes by the person himself through a kind of spontaneous self-suggestion. Hypnosis can be induced through relaxation techniques or through the use of startling, sudden stimulation. Hence, no doubt, the confusion of early practitioners, the reliance upon theatrical gestures, bizarre techniques, and the resulting comedy of errors in which this natural power was supposed to reside in the hypnotist alone, rather than in his subject as well. So it is hardly surprising that such forerunners in the field were themselves dramatically inclined, full of energy and vitality, and given to eccentricities of manner. Yet, perhaps in a democracy most of all, it is the eccentrics who often point out in theatrical fashion the road to creative inventions and frameworks of thought that other, less bold men will use studiously for years to come. The great men and women are not necessarily the most well balanced. They will not fit into psychology's norms, and in life I seriously question the advantages of the well-balanced schools of thought. For no individual is like any other, and it is precisely in those particularities of expression or original casts of mind that our individuality is most apparent. The democracy should be large enough to contain and foster such differences, where the nation can benefit from a pool of individual, eccentric, unalike talents and abilities that together add variety and power to all fields of national life. Freudian psychology casts those differences in the most unfavorable of lights, taught the individual to mistrust his own impulses and to turn away from the inner voice of intuition. The Freudian concepts were basically in direct opposition to Meyer's subliminal self. Myers did not deny the confusions, distortions, fears, and guilt that could arise in human experience, the subjective terrors, but he did not regard these as the most basic badge of humanity. He saw them instead as regrettable instances of human ignorance that served to hide from man the existence of his subliminal power, that source of being from which each individual life springs. As the medical profession became more technically oriented and treated patients with more and more impersonality, the patients began to desert. So-called quacks sprang up by the thousands in my time and continue to flourish in yours. How easy is it to so dismiss them, for they are often half illiterate, without any academic credentials, charlatans full of dramatic improvisation and mystic mumblings. Yet often they charge far less than the doctors while offering the patient personal attention, hope, and often treatment that works by utilizing suggestion to turn aside symptoms and give the patient some breathing time. In many cases, physicians themselves can do no more. I am not condoning the more mischievous of such practitioners, but some certainly would rival in successful treatment the record of more conventional medical men. Nor are a good many physicians above building up their own authority at the expense of the patient, increasing the patient's suggestibility to the most innocuous of the doctor's statements. The medical profession shows a remarkable lack of insight into the nature of its own blend of mysticism and drama, for its surroundings themselves confound the patient with instruments foreign to his knowledge, with the vast mysticism of science, evoking the doctor's authority and emphasizing the patient's helplessness. Strangely enough, the discovery of X-ray equipment did much to build up such an aura. Earlier, the doctor had to rely upon the patient's feelings about the inside of his body. Here, at least, doctor and patient were united in their ignorance. Neither of them could see through the patient's skin. With X-rays, however, the physician could view the individual's most intimate inside parts, allowing him a knowledge of a kind that the patient could not possess. The patient had to rely upon the doctor to interpret such pictures and translate them in understandable terms. Feelings became less important. Some doctors even shove them aside as beside the point, but physicians forget that their instruments themselves are highly important also as tools of suggestion and symbolic statements. Certainly, on many occasions, the tools physicians use may be undermined by their negative suggestive effect. Later in this book, I will elaborate considerably upon the mind's relationship to the body and its health from the larger framework of knowledge now available to me. Thus far, I have purposely held back from making certain statements about my own situation and the conditions of my existence, so as not to pull seniority. I am in fact deliberately speaking in contemporary terms so as to narrow the gap between us rather than widen it, at this point in any case, by emphasizing elements of my own experience with which you must be familiar. Those particularities of my existence do bring me definite advantages, however, and additional information which I would feel lax in not revealing. These include facts, certain to me, that still remain in the realm of the hypothetical to the living. These will be clearly stated later on. I will not take advantage of them, however, to fatten my own arguments at your own expense. Otherwise, I am confining my remarks to areas that are quite apparent in life once they are pointed out, and to comments concerning abilities and tendencies of the soul that show themselves through the agency of the living personality in chapter. Thank you very much.